So we are now gonna enter into the step where we do a bit of response analysis and response design. We're here in the planning process. Let's make this bigger. So remember, so we've done risk analysis. For main disaster risk, we've defined a crisis scenario. So most of the, in most cases, an ERP plan may have 2 to 3 main hazards against which we need to do a more advanced level of planning, and therefore we build a scenario. When you will be organizing a workshop in your country, you try to work on 1, 2 scenario, maximum 3 during a workshop. If you would need to work on an additional crisis scenario, maybe keep it for later, or phrase it or frame it as a preparedness action that you put in the preparedness action work plan. But for the sake of the workshop, here this week we will work on only 1 scenario to ease our life a little bit. Again, step 3, that is about mapping your existing response capacities, revolving around coordination, information management, assessment capacities. All this is something you would be more valuable for you to do this mapping with your partners than us during this week, where we have like 20 plus countries. And yeah, so this is why I'm now jumping into step 4, directly into step 4. And step 4 is about doing response analysis and response design. In my opinion, this is one of the most important steps, and often we actually undermine this a little bit. So here, with that session, we are going to appreciate the importance of conducting a response analysis, either using secondary information, or maybe in some cases there will be a need to consider collecting primary data and do a pre-crisis assessment. This is where we're going to start refining the key immediate needs, ensuring that the needs of all vulnerable groups are indeed taken into consideration, as well as much as possible, communities' preferred modalities of support. And then we are going to define the design of the immediate response. Remember how ERP here focuses on the first few weeks. And we need to define a package of priority activities for immediate response and the response modalities tailored to each crisis scenario. And this is also during that step, once we have our response plan, that we will have to define an indicator, a target, and then the funding requirement, okay? For your response, your immediate response. So when do you do response analysis and design? Where the response analysis part, again, can be really done maybe toward the end of an HNO analysis. And the response design can be done maybe during the HRP, the Humanitarian Response Plan development. However, think that your immediate response plan here needs to be a little bit more detailed. We'll come to that. In countries where YAS structures or the cluster approach is not in place, it can be done right before the nutrition sector develops its strategic response plan or its annual response plan. Or if you organize a first ERP event to start, moving forward with your ERP approach, it can be initiated during an ERP workshop, and you'll identify what needs to be done for this step to be taken. Okay. Again, as much as possible, engage relevant stakeholders. They can be based at subnational level. They can be those who will be among the first responders. Those will know very well what needs to be done during the very initial phase of a crisis before external assistance arrive much later often. Really try to do this planning with the partners. The local actors will be really active in the first weeks of the emergency, including local authorities. And any local organization that could potentially become a partner or who could be involved in assessing the needs. Or it could be, a moment where you also take the time to consult with organizations that are supporting people living with disabilities, the women-led organizations. And it's also a phase where you can take the time to work maybe with the cash working group, if you have one in country, and explore the feasibility, acceptance, and modalities for cash, and voucher assistance. So how do we do response analysis? I'm happy to hear any recommendations from you or examples from any countries. But basically, mainly you need to do a bit of a desk review, looking at existing information from existing surveys, existing assessment. We'll just talk about the cash, the prospect of using cash as a modality for response and plan for it even for early phase of the response. Maybe there is a feasibility assessment that was already done by a partner. Maybe you want to look at any protection and gender risks assessment. Some partners are doing safety audits. Some partners may have existing complaints and feedback mechanisms. These are a lot of information you can gather, appreciate, okay? And this is the wealth of knowledge, pre-crisis information you need to take into account to appreciate all those, the gender dynamics, and also, if needed, if you realize that there are missing information, you may want to consider doing a pre-crisis assessment. And this is an opportunity to consult with communities of the areas that you expect will be affected, and cross-check that your planning assumptions are adequate and that you take into account, again, preferred modality of assistance. And maybe there are other partners, sectors with whom you could do that to have a multi-sectoral angle to it. Okay, maybe we take a few minutes. I want to ask in the audience if we have someone who wants to share an example of how you go about doing response analysis in your country. How do you go about making sure you plan your strategic response design based on all the information I just mentioned. Or it's something we often don't take the time to do, unfortunately, and it's quite important. And there are a lot of other things we can look at. We talked about the seasonality of wasting earlier. There are a lot of maybe results from IPC or cadre harmonisé analysis. Yeah, I see a hand. I thought Stanley wanted to come in. Stanley, you're free to come in if you would like. Not anymore. So in the Google Drive, again, we're here on day 2. Stanley, you wanted to come in?
Yes, can you hear me, Cecil?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So no, I just wanted to provide an example of Malawi in terms of how the country does its analysis and then developing the response plan. So Malawi uses a sectoral approach. So we're not using necessarily the IASC cluster coordination mechanism, but we're using a government-led sector approach. So just an example of the recent floods which we had. So what happens is when a shock hits, like in this case, floods hit several districts. So the first people who are on the ground from the district, in this case, the District Civil Protection Committee, then organizes itself and does the initial analysis. And then they share the results with the national level. At the national level, the coordination is done by DODMA, which is the department responsible for disasters. And then there is a limit in which the district can respond. So if a shock affects more than 1,000 households, then the central level comes in to support. So in this case, because more than 3,000, 4,000 households were affected, so DODMA then requested for an intercluster coordination committee and then deployed an intercluster assessment team, which then went into the districts which were affected by the floods to verify the assessment reports, which were done by the DCPCs, and then to see if there was additional information that was required. So based on the further analysis, which was done by the intercluster assessment team, the data was then consolidated and then analyzed, and then the final report was produced, for which then the response plan was developed against. Thank you, Dova.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stanley. Very interesting to hear that. It sounds like Malawi is fairly well prepared, because to be able to do all that at early onset of crisis, it means that a lot happened prior to prepare. I guess it means that you already have a methodology in place for assessing immediate needs. You also have a coordination mechanism pre-established with a threshold for each district and how when the central level comes in. And I think very likely in countries like this, we may already have some district profile being well known, so that the pre-crisis information has been taken into account, and maybe there is already an overarching strategy for response. And this is a good example of how ideally we would like countries to be prepared. So in the examples we use for Zwantipolis, in the tool we're going to use for a short exercise. So again, here in the Google Drive, we're going to look at an Excel file called Session 7, Response Analysis and Design. We're not going to have time to do the group work exercise for response analysis, but when you will be doing this with your partners in country, there is an exercise whereby you encourage with your partners for all those pre-crisis information to be looked at, reviewed, and taken into account, and appreciate whether you miss some elements that would require pre-crisis assessment to be conducted. So as I said, so in the first tab, I've put some examples of secondary data you would ideally look at when you do response analysis. So it can be any results from any surveys. We talked about, any market and feasibility assessment for cash-based intervention. It can be any assessment coming out of more programmatic aspect of things. And then there are also a lot of sources of information you can gather from safety audits, assessment, feedback and complaint mechanisms, consultations with key stakeholders, key informants, rapid gender analysis, end user monitoring. Some agencies have that in place. And looking at all those existing information, you're going to identify, for instance, any protection-related risks or gender risks. And for each issue identified, you need to define an action for your response design. So for instance, here, if you understood from a safety audit assessment that the majority of the health and nutrition services are inaccessible for women and girls because they are far away from their home and the roads unsafe, and the women and girls are exposed to risks while accessing those services. In the design of your response, you will maybe decide to establish satellite sites or mobile units to be able to bring the services closer to the women and girls. Okay, so this is a step that is really important to do, and there are many different pre-crisis information we could look at. So once you've done this bit of response analysis, then we enter into the response design. Okay, and here again, we are not starting from scratch. We are not. It's very likely that wherever you are, you already have an overarching strategy for your nutrition response. Okay, so what you need to do here for that step is really to unpack as much as possible for those already strategic objectives, existing strategic objectives, and prioritize overarching activities, a set of immediate actions that will need to take place during the first weeks of crisis onset. Okay? So, so the first part here is that for each of the prioritized activities, sorry, let me go back to Swansea Police case study. We already have a nutrition response strategy in Zwantipolis. Okay, let me make this bigger. Let's say Zwantipolis already have an HRP, a humanitarian response plan. Okay, and these are the strategic objectives of the response plan. The first one is to ensure access to treatment of acute malnutrition. The second objective is to strengthen preventive nutrition interventions. So it's about, scaling up IYCFE, providing multiple micronutrient powders, for instance, or implementing a blanket SFP. Objective 3 is to be able to evaluate and monitor the nutrition situation. So it's about conducting, for instance, smart surveys. And the fourth objective is to support national mechanisms for nutrition coordination and information management. So these are our overarching objective and prioritized activities. Now, each group will have to unpack very carefully, for instance, for the group 1, who will focus on IYCFE, what needs to happen during the first week and week 2 to 4 to actually be able to scale up IYCFE. Okay, this is what you need to unpack now to make sure that your contingency plan or your ERP plan is not too vague. And just to say, I will scale up IYCFE interventions at times of crisis is not enough. It's not an actionable plan. So we really need to unpack in more details what needs to happen during those first few weeks. Okay? Okay. So the instructions here, yeah. We have, again, to define the immediate actions to be implemented during the first weeks. The group 1 will focus on what needs to happen to scale up IYCFE. Group 2 focuses on actions to establish micronutrient supplementation. Group 3 looks at conducting a smart survey. Group 4 focuses on coordination and IM. And group 5 works on immediate actions required to scale up treatment of acute malnutrition. Okay? And we will have 15 minutes. I hope this can be clear to everyone. And again, we are working on the same tool online, and each group works on a different tab. Okay? Okay. So we are now going to break into rooms. Be ready, colleagues. So I think it was in all the rooms I visited, I heard very interesting conversation, very interesting brainstorming, and really it was very interesting. I hope you appreciate and enjoyed it. We are going to take a few minutes to hear from a group. So I mean, it's nice to see how together, if you look at the Excel file, how an immediate action plan is coming together for each of those prioritized activity. It's really great to see that. Some of you were really good at defining really when whether in the first week or in week 2 and 4, what will be done. And I've heard some colleagues also unpacking some activities that I started to wonder, wow, are we really going to do that during the crisis, or is there something that could be done at preparedness? So is there a group who would like to do a bit of a summary of those discussions? Maybe maybe group 3 or 4 or group 5. If someone would like to share and summarize. Maybe, is there someone from group 3? I think you were having really interesting discussions. Anyone who would like to volunteer from group 3?
I can come in.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much, colleagues. This is Victor. So basically, nutrition smart surveys, the key objective here will to give us data or information on the malnutrition prevalence within the affected population. So the first key steps will be to do what you call context analysis of the affected area, do some kind of secondary information gathering. Then you will now look at, in this process, you will look at the available information. What are some of the available data that is already available? And what are the data gaps? What are the information gaps? Again, we'll have to check on the affected population. What kind of population groups do we want information on, and where there's missing updated information? Again, we look at the availability of resources in the first few days. Do we have resources to conduct this kind of assessment? Because normally smart surveys are resource intensive. And again, in terms of resources, I will put it broadly that it will mean financial resources, it will mean equipment, it will mean also availability of capacity, maybe in country or within the affected locality. Do we have capacity to conduct this kind of assessment? And again, still on context analysis, we'll also check on how accessibility issues and what is the urgency of the information. So in most cases, we'll find that we might opt to go for a rapid assessment instead of a full SMART, and maybe later on follow up with a full SMART survey. The idea is because rapid SMART normally it will give us a quick snapshot of the malnutrition situation in the affected population, and also the indicators, and also it's always not very resource intensive as full SMART surveys. The next now will be to, once this is done and we are sure of this, then we'll need to all start engaging the stakeholders. Both at sometimes you might want to do this at the capital level, as is the case of Afghanistan, and then also do the same at the local level, if it is the province or the district. Again, the other thing that we may want to do at this stage, also see what are the mechanisms in country. For example, in some countries, you'll have to get approvals, validations from the various working groups. So this also, you need to look at these processes. How are these processes? What is the timeline for these processes, so that you'll be able to identify how swift you can proceed with this kind of assessment, should there be need. Then we talked about follow-up. Then after that, then we'll need to develop tools, TORs, arrange for all the logistics requirements for this kind of assessment. And then approvals also, of course, this also will be, and also now have a work plan for this. So I will summarize it as such, and then I will also request my colleagues, if there's anything that I might have missed that we discussed, kindly chip in. Thank you. Over to you, Cecil.
Thank you very much, Victor. This is really great to see all the planning, thinking going into that from group 3. So when you will be doing this with your partners in country, try to put a bit of a time frame to those key immediate actions, whether it's something you think you will be doing during the first week of crisis onset or what comes a little bit later on. And I think that group 3, while you were unpacking all those key actions, you may have come to realize that there are a few things that maybe could be done before the crisis hits at preparedness phase. And I think this is a realization that likely happened in all the groups. That maybe, for instance, I'm just, thinking a bit out loud here. You mentioned how you may need to develop tools or protocols and have them validated by, a working group or a government. I think this would be great if it could be done at preparedness phase. You will save a lot of time in being actually able to do and conduct your survey if you have your protocols, your tools, and your equipment secured somewhere, and all this methodology to assessing the needs and evaluating the situation already pre-agreed with the relevant authorities and pre-agreed with your stakeholders. Okay? So this is when you go through such an exercise that you can appreciate the details it takes to plan ahead. Okay? Is this talking to everybody? Is this something that you also reflected on in different groups, in other groups? So I think, colleagues, you can take the time later on to appreciate what was done by other groups, whether working on IYCF, where we can realize IYCF or micronutrient supplementations, or you name it, you can realize that sometimes you may need to plan for actions that would fall into different domains. And little by little, you're going to come up with a bunch of immediate actions. You're coming up with your immediate response plan. Okay, so you can maybe look at all the proposed activities from different groups later on. Okay, so basically, this is what it takes to start planning for your immediate response plan. And in the workshop package, again, when you do that in country, you have a second group work exercise that we won't have time to do today. That now that you refine a little bit your immediate response plan, the following step is to define indicators and calculate your targets and your funding requirements. Okay, and this is maybe a phase where you're gonna refine everything. Okay, but we will not be able to do that this week. Look again at the GNC humanitarian needs analysis guidance I was talking about, and go to table 4. There it lists core indicators that you can choose, and it gives you some indications on how to calculate target as well. It's a really interesting document to look at. Okay. So when we do this in country or at subnational level, it's also important to start compiling everything you do also in the draft ERP plan. Okay, so you'll see that we're here, response, analysis, and strategy. You have a place where you can put all your immediate actions, your targets, indicators, and start costing a little bit all this. Okay, but again, for the sake of time, I would just advise you to, if you have time, to look at the step-by-step guide, look at the instructions for step 4, examples of preparedness actions. And in some of you, I think in some of your groups, you started to realize or anticipate on possible obstacles you may face. For instance, in group 3, Jacinta said, "Oh, you know how each time I have a rapid smart survey to conduct at times of crisis, I always face delays because I don't have the anthropometric equipment." That's a gap you identify at preparedness, translate it right away into a preparedness action. What can you do now at preparedness to mitigate this gap you've identified and put it into the preparedness action work plan? So if some of you have the time and would volunteer to start putting in our preparedness action work plan some of the identified preparedness actions, it would be great. Okay, we'll come back to that later, tomorrow. Okay, so is there any questions? We have a bit of time before we switch to the last session of the day. Any questions or reflections, remarks at this stage? On step 4, response analysis and design. Okay. I think it starts to be a bit late for some colleagues. I hope we're still all together. I'm going to launch a poll just to check that everybody is doing okay. If it works.
Okay.
We are okay.
You're okay?
Okay.
Okay, we're still together. I wanted to launch a poll just quickly to check that everybody is with me. Is it working?
Yeah, it's working. Oh.
So colleagues, are you overall satisfied with this workshop so far? Yes, great. Okay, cool. Thank you. I have 21 responses. We are still all together. Good. Ruth, you have a hand up. Would you like to come in?
Yes, thanks very much, Cecil. I think you had asked whether we had a question on the session that you've just concluded. For us, we're in group 2, and the group 2 was micronutrients, and there was a specific focus on multiple micronutrients. And I was just wondering whether it does consider existing programs, because we do know that some of the contexts we don't have multiple micronutrients. So in this case, it was, I guess, for the purpose of the exercise. And what we need to do is more consider pre-existing interventions, because knowing multiple micronutrients, it's a behavior change type of intervention, which you require to integrate as part of the infant and young child feeding program to improve the complementary feeding of the children. So doing it in a sort of IDP setting where maybe there was no pre-existing program, then it may not be the best. But I think it's considering what are the prior micronutrient programs that were there that then we can be able to use. Just wanted to clarify that. Over.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ruth. Definitely, you're absolutely right. This was really for the sake of the exercise, and appreciate what it takes to unpack really the immediate actions. But you're definitely right, and it will depend of context, of course. So whether you are planning for an IDP setting where sprinkles will be distributed, or whether you are planning in a different context with host communities and your approach is tied to a more comprehensive, holistic preventive package with IYCF and maybe other type of interventions. Tailor everything to your context, but really focus on unpacking immediate actions that will enable you to have this strategy implemented timely. That's all. Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you, Ruth. Do not hesitate to come back anytime, and any colleagues online, if you have at any moment you want to chip in and share a thought, or you have a suggestion, something to share, please feel free. We're together here to learn from each other as well. Okay, so this is the end of the session, and so we can stop the recording.